Well, good morning, beloved confirmands. It's Wednesday, November 18th, and we're about to jump into class number 3. So, we are coming to you today from the church building. This is my office here. And we're going to try to have class here today. Mix it up a little bit. And before we get started, though, of course, I wanted to review a couple things. First, remind you that there are some expectations for this year. If you'd like a recap of those, you can check our either the first or second video. They're there for you if you want them. Now, I'd like to think about where we've been the last couple weeks in terms of the content, or at least our last couple class sessions, because it's been a few weeks since we've actually met. But anyways, because our first class session, right, we talked about the creation story. And last class session, we talked about the flood. And of course, we're talking about these because they are stories of the faith. Right? Stories, God's story that changes our story. And so I want you to grab that pad of paper. Maybe you started writing during last class session. You don't have to have those notes, but if you do have a clean page, we're going to recap a few things. And I want you to write these down if you're able. Stories do 4 things, remember? And I'm going to add to this list now. So, stories do 4 things. 1, they communicate. Right? They communicate some things to us about God, about the world, about ourselves, about our human experience. Stories also hold truth for us. They communicate some things that we hold to be true about God, about the world, about our history. They also touch our emotions, right? They touch our heart oftentimes. It's part of what makes them so effective. But stories also build our identity, right? They give us a sense of community together. Stories do these 4 things. And of course, in our Lutheran tradition, we often hear stories in worship. That's why worship is such an important part of our faith. It's where we hear God's stories, God's good news, God's saving acts, God's story. And of course, the way we interpret those stories then is important. That's also why there's often preaching or reflection on the scriptures that we hear. And so we must listen then when we interpret, right? Let's add a couple things to this list of ours. When we hear stories, we have to listen, and then we have to interpret. Do these stories line up with what we hold to be true about God, about the way we love God, about the way God calls us to love our neighbors? What about where God shows up in the world? We started thinking about that in the last few class sessions, and we'll continue to think about that today. And of course, we also continue to keep coming back to this question of how is God making the world right? How do we interpret that action of God? That's part of what we think God is about. And so today, we're hitting one of the next high points in the Hebrew scripture stories. But before we get there, let's recap class number 1. The creation story. We heard some good news here, right? It reminds us that we are loved, that we are created to be very good, right? God makes us masterpieces. We're beautiful, wonderful, amazing, impactful, unforgettable masterpieces, every last one of us. And since we then are created in such love, we can then pass that love on to others. We can be agents of that love for others too. And then the story of the flood, right? We heard about how God floods out all that stuff in the world that tears apart the good creation, that robs us of life. And yet, even then, God decides that violence is not the way to solve things. Remember, God hangs up the war bow in the clouds? And of course, we remember that there's some good news in that God seeks to make things right in the world, not through violent means, but hopefully now through creative means. It isn't always easy to have those parts of our lives that are sinful, that are death. It's not easy for those things to be flooded out, but we trust that it is part of the renewing work that God is about. And so today, the story of Abraham and Isaac. Now, who is Abraham? Maybe you remember that song, Father Abraham had many sons. Many sons had Father Abraham. Well, Abraham had many children, and Abraham's children had many children, and they had children, and so on and so forth. And we look back in our tradition as Abraham is one of the originators of the faith. One of the patriarchs, maybe, is one of the words we might use. But regardless, Abraham, in the book of Genesis, he's the person to whom God promises a great nation. God promises that through Abraham, there will be a great people that are birthed, as numerous as stars in the sky, even though for much of Abraham's life, he and his wife Sarah have been unable to conceive children. But God makes a covenant with Abraham. God promises Abraham that things will change. And eventually, Abraham and Sarah conceive. And she finds it so funny that she is conceived in her old age that she laughs, which is what Isaac's name means, laughter. And so then much of the book of Genesis goes on to tell this story of Abraham and Abraham's family, who's thought to be the father of Judaism and Christianity and Islam. Of course, Abraham was not a perfect character, not a perfect person, which is perhaps part of the reason why the Abraham story is so enduring, as it reminds us that none of us are perfect, but that God shows up anyway. But now I want you to listen. I've got a guest reader for us, one of our esteemed members, Drinda Kiner. You may know Drinda. She's been participating in some of the worship services, Park and Pray, but she's also been involved in many other ministries of the church. And so I invite you now to listen as she reads this story for us from her home.
A reading from the Message translation of Genesis 22, 1 through 18. After all this, God tested Abraham. God said, "Abraham." "Yes," answered Abraham, "I am listening." God said, Take your dear son, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains that I will point out to you." Abraham got up early in the morning and saddled his donkey. He took 2 of his young servants and his son Isaac. He had split wood for the burnt offering. He set out to the place God had directed him. On the 3rd day, he looked up and saw the place in the distance. Abraham told the 2 young servants, "Stay here with the donkey. The boy and I are going over there to worship. Then we'll come back to you." Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and gave it to Isaac his son to carry. He carried the flint and the knife. The 2 of them went off together. Isaac said to Abraham his father, "Father." "Yes, my son." "We have flint and wood, but where's the sheep for the burnt offering?" Abraham said, "Son, God will see to it that there is a sheep for the burnt offering." And they kept on walking together. They arrived at the place to which God had directed him. Abraham built an altar. He laid out the wood. Then he tied up Isaac and laid him on the wood. Abraham reached out and took the knife to kill his son. Just then, an angel called out to him from heaven, "Abraham, Abraham." "Yes, I am listening." "Don't lay a hand on that boy. Don't touch him. Now I know how fearlessly you fear God. You didn't hesitate to place your son, your dear son, on an altar for me." Abraham looked up, and he saw a ram caught in the thicket with its horns. Abraham took the ram and sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son. Abraham named the place God Yireh. God sees to it. That's where we get to say, on the mountain of God, he sees to it. The angel of God spoke from heaven a second time to Abraham. "I swear God's sure word, because you have gone through this and have not refused to give me your son, your dear, dear son, I'll bless you. Oh, how I'll bless you. And I'll make sure your children flourish like stars in the sky, like sand on the beaches, and your descendants will defeat their enemies. All nations on earth will find themselves blessed through your descendants because you obeyed me." End of reading.
Abraham and Isaac. Kind of a wild story. I have a few questions for you now, as is almost always the case following one of our stories that we hear. I'm going to share them in a moment, and then I'm going to post them on the screen. I'm going to invite you then to pause the video and spend just a few minutes on your own writing down your responses on that notepad as you think about the implications of this story. So, question number 1 is, how do you think Isaac and Sarah and Abraham each felt in this story? Right? Knowing the history of Abraham and Sarah and their trouble conceiving, and then somehow thinking that they've been asked by God to sacrifice their own son, how would they feel? I want you to write responses for each of them. Think in emotional language here, feeling language. And then question number 2, I want you to think about what God promises. Even if you need to rewind the video here and listen to Drinda tell the story again, what does God promise? It's question number 2. And then question number 3, I want you to think about, when does Abraham look up? And what does he see when he looks up the second time? What does he see there? And then we'll recap. So ready? Go. So if this is the third story now, the third story that we are learning, that we're considering, the third story of God's saving acts, what makes this story another saving act? And what good news is emerging here? Oftentimes in life, when we find ourselves in compromising circumstances, when we're overwhelmed with anxiety or grief or sorrow or vulnerability, oftentimes it can be difficult to see what God is up to perceive what God is up to and how God is providing for us, even in those difficult circumstances. I think sometimes it takes the help of others around us to help us look up, to help us recognize how God is making a way for us to move through these impossible circumstances. For I think this story, at least on some level, is about the way that God changes our perspective when we are in the midst of these most difficult moments of life, and that God is there with us in them. God turns us toward what saves us when we need it. Now I'm going to send you with some homework, and this homework is a family endeavor. There will be some more questions about this story, and I'll even include the text of the story, the Message translation that we are using, that Drinda read for us. And I'd like you as a family to work through those responses. There'll be a series of questions per usual, but then there will also be some other exercises together, the prayers that you share, and of course the sermon notes and the worship that I look forward to reading about in your sermon notes as you respond to those services as well. And so, dear confirmands, I give thanks again for this time together. I know it's perhaps not exactly what we had planned for this year, but I'm glad we're able to gather and get to know each other, even through this sort of screen situation that we're in. I look forward to hearing your responses. Until then, God's peace be with you.